following is a production of Government CIO Media.
Hi, and welcome to GovCast. I'm Camille Tutti, Editor-in-Chief of Government CIO Media.
And I'm Amanda Ziadet, reporter with Government CIO Media.
Today, we are excited to welcome Pete Newell to the studio. Pete is the managing partner at BMNT, a veteran-founded startup that solves national security problems. Fun fact, BMNT is military shorthand for Begin Morning Nautical Twilight. Pete spent nearly 35 years in the Army, and his last gig there was as director of the Army Rapid Equipping Force.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Pete.
Hey, thank you.
So as Camille mentioned, you spent over 3 decades in the military, eventually working with the Rapid Equipping Force to harness the emerging tech needed to provide the U.S. Army Forces with innovative solutions to fulfill its missions worldwide. How did you end up there in that division of the Army?
So depending on the version you want to hear, it's either an accident or serendipity. I spent the vast majority of almost my whole career as an infantryman. And the last job I had before the REF, I was brigade commander, and I was actually in Iraq. I'm doing a great job, and General Ordiano, who was the force on Iraq at the time, knew he was leaving Iraq and going back to something. Eventually, he'd become the chief of staff of the Army. And he stopped and, visited me in Iraq at one point. His 6'9" frame sitting on a couch in my office stretched halfway across the room, and he says, Pete, you've done a great job here, and I think you have the material to be a general officer, and I'm going to take care of your next job. And it's the last I heard. Unfortunately, the way they handle colonels like that sometimes is the Pentagon has what they call this black book, and it's they take the personnel files from 5 or 6 really high-achieving people, and when the Secretary of Defense needs a new aide or the chairman needs an aide or something, they hand them this book and they pick one of those files. So I was one of those guys, and there's 6 files in there, and I think there were 5 jobs. And I was in Iraq and not available and whatever else. But when they got done with the circle, I was the only file left, so there was no job left. Unfortunately, when that happens is there's no jobs left because the job cycle has ended, and General Ordiano gets handed his file back and says, here you go. And he had no place to put me. So, he's in the Pentagon talking to another 3-star who was the G3, the vice chief for operations, and said, can you help me find a decent place to put Pete Newell? And he said, I have 2 places to put him. One is my executive assistant inside the Pentagon, and I know Pete Newell, and I know I hate the job, or I have the Rapid Equipping Force. So I ended up in the Rapid Equipping Force. I literally had never heard of it. What I got from the personnel guys, they sent me a note, and I was still in Iraq, get ready to redeploy. And I'm going, guys, really, I know that I'm moving in 45 days. Where am I going? And I got a note that basically said, can't tell you about your assignment, but when can you be in Washington, D.C.? And the next thing I got was a note saying, congratulations, you're going to be the next director of the Army's Rapid Equipping Force. I had to Google it to figure out what it was. It was just... And I will tell you honestly, the first thought that went through my head is, what did I do to deserve this? Last I heard, I was doing okay. And the next thing I know is I'm sitting at someplace at Fort Belvoir, and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Just the opportunities that grew from it is, it's a fascinating place for me. Be careful what you complain about.
Right. So when you were leaving the Army in 2017, Daniel Gore of the Lexington Institute wrote a post titled, Farewell to one of the Army's best. What made you the best? Or to paraphrase, what made you successful in the military?
What Daniel Gore, I think, was writing about most, particularly at period of time in the Rapid Equipping Force. When I got there in 2010, I would tell you it was a dying animal. Bruce Jetty, who's now the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, beautifully designed the organization, and the guys that followed it, I think, didn't quite beautifully execute it, but it got to the point where it was really good at spitting out products and throwing them over the wall and beating its chest about how great it was. It wasn't helping the Army enterprise do better. I came into REF as an operator and really didn't care about the products as much as I did the problems. And as somebody with a special operation background, part of it is how do you get other people to do your work? And in my mind, it was how do I recruit people to take care of these problems and just use my resources to get things moving. So I was very honest about what I wanted to do, but I made sure that we built REF as a problem-generating organization to spit things out on the battlefield. In 2012, Defense News, I think, published their first list of the top 100 influential people in the defense industry, and I landed on the list at like 84. The only colonel that I think has ever been on the list, simply because I got so good at articulating problems and building ecosystems around them that people were bringing us money. In my time on the REF, the $160 million budget in the organization, I invested over $1.5 billion in a 2-year period, simply because we were really good at finding problems and articulating them in a manner that helped us recruit other organizations and people to team with us to deliver something to the battlefield. And people were bringing us large chunks of money to do that. And I think that's really what Daniel Gray was trying to get at is here's a colonel who's not part of the enterprise system who's invested $1.5 billion over 2 years doing stuff that's good for the Army, and he's done it without breaking the law and without any, and I call it special permissions. I had a few, but they weren't radically outside the acquisition stream.
I read that when you were with the Rapid Equipping Force, you transformed a Bobcat into a vehicle that could protect soldiers from IEDs. Is there something that you see that's missing today in the battlefield that could be transformed with technology that we have today, similar to that Bobcat?
Yeah, that Bobcat's missing. No, I'm serious. I will tell you that, that's one of those cases where it took us 6 months from the time we came up with a concept to put that thing on the battlefield, and we built 54 of them eventually. Essentially a commercial Bobcat with an appliqué robotics package on it, and a piece of an M1A1 tank mine roller system bolted to it, a software package that was designed by, I think, Spaware, was a Navy facility, and it was put together by Space and Missile Defense, place in Huntsville, Alabama, and all that was paid for on an Air Force Research Lab contract. It was interesting because we built that thing to service the infantry squads in Afghanistan. Well, counter-IED equipment like that is the purview of the engineers. And the engineers wanted to build something bigger as an engineer vehicle, not that kind of stuff. So this is one of those places where REF inserted something on the battlefield that was highly value-added, that was in the white space between things. But as soon as we quit doing it, the military, or the Army in particular, reverted back to the parochialism that says infantry people don't clear mines and think that's an engineer mission. So off it goes. And now we're back to there is no replacement for it anywhere. Really? On the battlefield today. So the system is destined to repeat itself again and again and again and again because we forget the lessons we learn every time.
Going back to your point about problem solving, so you co-founded BMNT with 4 others from the Army, Special Forces, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force. And someone on your team described the company as MacGyver if he could be reconstituted as a company. What do you actually do?
So I will tell you the company, beyond the fact that it was founded by veterans, we applied what I would call, that special operations type background, but it is a very diverse organization of people with current and prior military service. I have several reservists as part of the team, but also I have designers, hackers, and makers that come from the Valley. I have hard science folks, data scientists, those types of folks. And it really is the melting pot between us that takes the best of what we're good at and allows us to focus on hard, intractable problems. In some cases, you look at us as consultants, because we'll go in and tear something apart and look at it and say, here's the data behind it. Some cases, you'll look at us as educators. In fact, we spun out a nonprofit that does one of the coolest graduate level courses in the country. And in some cases, we actually build products of innovation support tools and diagnostics that actually support innovation as a whole.
Tell us a little bit more about the educating part that you do. And I believe that Hacking for Defense is also part of that effort.
So we started out, essentially prototyping ways to help people understand how innovation really works. which led to my introduction to Steve Blank. We actually bumped into each other by accident on a serendipity strike. That led to taking, when Steve and I first met, we were in a room that had driveway walls on both sides, and Steve started talking about lean methodology, and I started talking about OODA loops in Afghanistan and other things, and realized that the graphic that Steve and I each drew separately were identical. We were talking about the same thing. He'd been teaching it for 11 years. I've been applying it on the battlefield for, several. The only difference was the words we used to describe the things, and the fact that he started with ideas and delivered products. I started with problems and delivered solutions. Everything else was the same. When we mashed the two together, we realized that we had an answer that the innovation problems and the speed of recognition something's changed, and the delivery of solutions, particularly the battlefield of national security enterprise, that didn't exist before. We were challenged by some folks to actually build Hacking for Defense as a class at Stanford, and did it in about 9 months. In the process of doing that, the basis for the class is a reverse classroom. There is no lecture in the classroom. It is essentially taking teams of students who take on a government problem, and they literally treat themselves as a startup for 10 weeks. And their job is to apply lean methodology to first validating they're working on the right thing, and then getting through the class. But eventually what happened is the people who were bringing us problems said, listen, this is a cool class, but I have thousands of more problems, and I have a workforce that can't do this. So I'm willing to give you problems if you create training for me. So at the same time we were building this academic course, we had to create a series of enterprise-level training courses to help other people be part of the ecosystem. And that's really where the training basis should come from.
So how did meeting Steve Blank, a serial Silicon Valley entrepreneur, change the trajectory of BMNT?
First to tell you, I have no business background, so I had no clue who Steve Blank was. We were prototyping something over spring break. I forget what year, I think it's 2014. And we were using a bunch of graduate students from Stanford Graduate School of Business and the engineering school. And we had the teams working, and it just happened that one of the students was taking Steve's Lean Launchpad class. And the student went to Steve and said, hey, Steve, you heard these guys from BMNT? They sound just like you and talking. So the guy brought Steve down to the office. And essentially I found out like an hour before Steve Blank's coming to the office, and will you meet him? And I'm Steve who? So in the door comes this short, gray-haired, curly-haired guy, and of course Steve has no idea why he's in the office, and I have no idea why I'm in the office, and we start this conversation. Okay, what do you do? And that turned into Steve starting to carve on the board about lean, and me starting to talk about what we were doing. That 20-minute session lasted 3.5 hours. We talked for 3.5 hours. And Steve, as he walked out the door, said, listen, I love what you guys are doing. I really want to be part of this. He literally said, I want you to take every bit of IP I have in lean methodology, and we're going to rewrite it for DOD. And we have been at it ever since.
That's a really cool story, actually.
Yeah, so the 3.5 hours really cut down all the time in the day that you had for everything else you had going on.
It didn't matter. I mean, it's just, Joe Felter and I talk about working with Steve in the early days. It's like surfing a comet's tail. Steve is the hardest working retired guy I have ever met. And Steve and I, we talk a lot, but every once in a while I go on a hike in the woods and just talk. And the other things we talked about retirement was there's no such thing. That you, in fact, earned your freedom to work on things that you want to be passionate about. And Steve does nothing that he's not passionate about. Neither do I at this point. Which means everything you do, you're passionate about. That you work just as hard as you ever did, but you're much happier doing it.
And I want to go back to you teaching and learning. What are some of the most valuable things you've learned from teaching students?
The first one is the misnomer of millennials or today's youth not being interested in things in the national security space. In fact, when we decided to teach the first class at Stanford, we had no idea if any student would show up. And to their credit, we had over 150 students show up at the information centers. We could only take 32 kids in the class, which was astronomical. Now, I would tell you, flash forward, next year there are 30 universities offering this course. And that, I think, is a testament that there is a high degree of interest in and amongst young technologists in our universities who want to do something impactful with their time and their energy. They're just not going to enlist to do it. They want to do what they want to do. They're interested, but we have sold them short in terms of providing them opportunities to get involved in things that are important to the government. So lesson number one is we need to change how we provide opportunities for people like that to get involved. And Hacking for Defense has turned out to be a great opportunity to do some of that. The second one that I learned from working with students and watching this over hundreds of iterations right now is that problem curation combined with lean methodology works. It absolutely works. I've watched it time and time again, even when I looked at a problem in a group of students and been saying, oh, man, I don't know how that, I just don't see this coming together. It happens. At some point in the process of doing discovery and doing this rapid iteration of hypothesis development and real interviews with people, the answers fall out of what they're doing. Sometimes it's at the last second, but the process actually works. It's a discipline.
So we all have 24 hours in the day. You're super busy. So what do you do for fun when you're not problem solving? Is there anything that you like to do when you're not in work mode?
So this is fun. There's no such thing as work. And I'd say that jokingly, but when I retired, I had 3 rules. And one says I'm not going to do things I'm not passionate about. I'm not going to work with people I don't like, and I'm not going to work with people I don't trust. The false side of that is everything you do you're passionate about, and the work-life balance goes out the window. This is what we do. I work with I can't say enough about the people in BMNT. How much fun it is to be engaged with some of them, and sometimes it's really painful, but most of the time it really is fun. My wife and I travel. My kids are out of the house. I got one in Baghdad as a captain, and another at the University of Arizona, so I have the opportunity to go places and do things. There's plenty to do there.
So we talk a lot and hear a lot about government officials transitioning to private sector, and especially in the IT realm. How was it like for you transitioning from the Army into the private sector?
And I'll give it to you this way, and I'll give you a real anecdote in a second. I probably see 4 or 5 messages that people who ask me, hey, I'm getting ready to leave the service, colonels and generals and senior people who have looked at what we've done and saying, okay, you got a really cool life and you're in a great business and things. How do you do that? I'll take them through a series of things. One is there are no jobs at BMNT. It really is. There are groups of passionate people who have come to it for a reason. I don't read resumes. I've never sent my own resume out. I knew what I was going to do when I was going to leave. I didn't know how. The challenge a lot of people have is I bought the house, I got the kids in the school. I can't move. I got to stay in one place. The challenge that I give to most people is you realize it isn't the expertise you learned in the last 5 years in government that makes you valuable. It's what got you through X number of years of service. And if you're willing to start over, the world's open to you. But if you're leaving government service and you need a job, you're not going to gain your freedom to work on the things you're passionate for if you're just flitting from one job to the next. If you're willing to strip it all away and start over and say you're relying on who you are and do something, then the world's wide open.
So after 3 decades in the military, where there is a very, very clear hierarchy, when you come into the private sector, is it strange to be working with other veterans when rank no longer matters?
I actually did the relief. And believe it or not, and maybe I'm different. I've actually never had that conversation with somebody. To me, it was a relief not to be, you're the point at the person at the point of the spear all the time, and you're the colonel, and everything's afraid to talk to you, and you got 15 people in between you and the ground truth on something. So working in the Valley with people of lots of different ranks, you just stop looking at rank and anything else. It's not about even how high you are in the organization. If you're not the expert in something in the room, you're not the expert. and you need to sit down and hush up and let the expert talk. And I think that's the rule in general.
And you said you knew, leaving the Army, what you wanted to do afterwards?
Yeah, kind of, sort of. I knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to go work for somebody else. I got to the point that I was addicted to what I was doing. As I said, that ref was really a godsend to me. I never realized that that's what I wanted to do in my life, but I wanted to solve problems and work in that environment. I learned an incredible amount in 3 years of ref, which gave me a lot of confidence to say I can go do something else. And, the idea of moving to Silicon Valley, long before there was a DIUX, I actually hired guys in Silicon Valley to be the ref proxy out there. And it was one of those guys, Joe Felter, who became my partner, who, when he heard me say, hey, I'm going to retire, said, great, you're going to move here, right? And we're going to keep doing this, but we're just going to do it from the other direction. So I moved to Palo Alto to start BMNT. I didn't have a job. My wife and I agreed that, we had enough money to survive there for a year. My youngest son was starting high school, and what we agreed to was to put 4 years into Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, even if it meant we would move into a one-bedroom or two-bedroom apartment to do it. And at that level of commitment freed me up to go through the repetitive start something, fail, start, fail, until you actually settled on a business model that actually worked. Year two of BMNT was ugly. I went without a paycheck for a year. And in Silicon Valley, it's not a pleasant thought.
How did you meet this group that you co-founded your company with?
Serendipity struck again.
For the third time?
No, actually, it's been multiple times. I was working on a subterranean robotic control problem in Afghanistan. And I was looking for some of the leading experts in non-line-of-sight robotic control, which means no cables, no cords. And one of the folks was a professor at Stanford. So I made a trip out to Stanford. I had never been to Palo Alto. In fact, I'd been to California a couple of times. I didn't even know where Stanford was. And I showed up to see this professor, and about the time Joe Felter, who is now, he's on leave from BMNT to serve time back in the Pentagon. Joe had just retired from the Army as a Special Forces colonel. And he was back at Stanford working and had been there for I think 2 weeks when I got there. So Joe was kind of assigned to shepherd me around campus, and we immediately got lost. I eventually found the professor, and essentially I didn't get the solution I was looking for. It wasn't a solvable problem in the time frame I had. But as we're leaving, Joe and I got to start talking about the problems that I was facing. And Joe was like, oh, yeah, and I get that. And we got to the edge of camp, and he says, hey, why don't you take a ride with me? And we literally jumped in his car, and we did what I call a pub crawl to startups. We just went and talked to people he knew. And I would find the most fascinating people in the garages. And they'd tell me what they were building, and I'd tell them about my kind of problem. We'd have a great conversation, and they'd pull out napkins and business cards. And, it was just exceptionally intellectually stimulating to have those kinds of one-on-one conversations with really bright, brilliant people. Well, it got to the point that I was sending Joe, 2 or 3 problems, and he was translating in something that made sense in the Valley, and he'd run around and recruit people to come to Stanford. I'd show up a month later, and there'd be a classroom full of, students, professors, investors, startup folks, and just, curious bystanders. But in that room, I would find 5 or 6 people that I could actually agitate into doing something. If I tried to do that in Washington, D.C. as the ref director, I'd have to go through thousands to find those type of people. I was spending a lot of time at Stanford. Got to the point I just couldn't. So I eventually hired Joe to be my proxy. I would send him stuff, and he would do this, and we'd turn this into a real model. And Joe then hired William, which is one of my partners, and another guy who didn't last very long with us, but it was that synchronization. Eventually, I was doing so much work on the West Coast that I had a $100 million program management problem. The $100 million worth of work being done on the West Coast, and all of my program management people in Washington, D.C. And that kind of work, I call it fragile. It's high risk. It's high risk of not seeing something and taking advantage of the ability to accelerate something, or high risk of it coming apart at the seams because nobody was there to make sure everybody was doing what they're supposed to. So I asked some folks here, they're on program, that says, I need somebody on the West Coast who has, program management, acquisition background, whatever. And, a week later, I got a call and said, hey, guy in Crystal City said, stop by my office. I have somebody for you. And I dropped in, and there was this woman who had been building satellite systems and doing program management for folks in Los Angeles, who was tired of working in a skiff and wanted to do something cool and outside. And we probably lasted through a 10-minute conversation, and I hired her for ref.
No resume.
No resume. Eventually, I read her resume. There was a whole thing, a bunch of things I never knew about her until later. I was like, oh my God, if I'd known that, I would have paid you 3 times as much as I did. Thank God. When serendipity strikes in the same place multiple times, eventually you realize that you are creating the opportunity for really good things to happen.
And if you want to reach Pete, you can hit him up on Twitter. He is Peter A. Newell. This episode is sponsored by Lumina. Lumina's mission is to use AI systems to protect the world. To learn more about the company, visit its website at luminaanalytics.com.
It's so wonderful that Pete was so willing to share so many of his personal stories with us today, because that's exactly what we are trying to do with GovCast.
Exactly. I just love hearing people's personal stories. These days, we usually get the headlines, the news in a podcast, but I'm really interested in the personalities, the people behind the headlines, like I keep saying. Learning about what makes people tick, their passions, how they react in certain situations, and most of all, also how they were able to overcome challenges. That is something that I find really great because people can learn from that.
Yeah, as a journalist, we meet so many people. We talk to so many people. But oftentimes you don't really get to know the person themselves, just kind of what they're doing, their office, their organization, their government agency. So it's really special to be able to hear people's anecdotes and how they got from where they were to where they are.
Right. We know the technologists, we know the CTO, we know the CIO and the CISO, but we really don't know the stories behind, Jane Doe, who is the CISO. What has her journey been like? What is her story?
So we really hoped you enjoyed Pete's story. We'll be back next week with a full episode of GovCast, but we hope to do more personal stories and spin-offs of our interviews with our special guests.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm Camille Tootie.
And I'm Amanda Ziede, and this is GovCast. GovCast is a production of Government CIO Media. It's produced by Tracy Madigan and edited by Rob Ford. Our theme music is provided by Big Hoax. Our executive producer is Michael Hoffman. If you're interested in sponsoring GovCast, you can email Andy Andrews at randrews@governmentcio.com.